Brought to you by...
Each and every one of us have suffered through varying forms of trauma throughout our daily lives. Most of you, I can assume, were brought into the world through it, in the form of childbirth, which, while a beautiful yet disgusting of an act as it may be, is also highly traumatic for both mother and child alike. Why do you think you come into the world screaming? No matter what type of trauma that you may have experienced, it will undoubtedly have lasting effects on your psyche. Most of us can just move past these effects. However, some are so deeply scarred by them that no matter what we do, there is ultimately no escaping their grasp. The ways in which we interact with one another in various forms, no matter how small, affect us in different ways. Generally, we greet each other with pleasantries, a hello, a kind handshake, a solemn smile. A casual smile is usually a comforting gesture, a sign that things are okay, and an expression of mutual respect. However, what happens when this gesture is twisted, and you suddenly find yourself fearing its emergence across a stranger's face? When approaching this film, writer and director Parker Finn set out to create an experience that feels like an escalating nightmare. And that happens because, as Parker himself said, the evil in this film uses a smile as a mask to hide its true intentions. The film's premise feels very much like It Follows, and the filmmaker has even stated that that was an inspiration. In the story, after witnessing a bizarre, traumatic incident involving a patient, Dr. Rose Cotter starts experiencing frightening occurrences that she cannot explain. As an overwhelming terror begins taking over her life, Rose must confront her troubling past in order to survive and escape her horrifying new reality. There's an immediate beauty within the opening of this film, slamming us in hard on the face of a woman, her eyes glazed and white, cold and dead, jaw slacked, without a smile. The camera slowly rotating to reveal her lifelessly laying in the disarray of her bedroom. We then track across a table, housing the smiling photos of her and her family. This is where we are introduced to our protagonist, revisiting the memory of her trauma, a dream that reminds her of family tragedy, a dream that startles her violently awake. From this, we immediately know that she herself is mentally unstable to some degree, living with these traumatic memories. The fragile pane of glass that makes up her psyche is already fractured. This is an important thing to note, given that the pressure that she is set to endure is only going to cause this to further splinter. In these opening moments, we learn a lot about Rose and the environment that she has grown to place herself into. We see that she is a form of psychologist. As we move into her surroundings, the hospital feeling warm and vibrant, walls painted pink and blue, rather than your traditional clinical white or other neutral tones. Rather than her distancing herself from her trauma, the way we later learn that her sister did, Rose has let it define her whole life to some degree, using it to shape her career and everyday surroundings. While many would have gotten it out of the way early on, Parker chooses to hold out his opening titles, a full 13 minutes into the film, only finally slamming us with the anxiety-inducing text once the entity has been passed to Rose. which is interesting given that the film was originally titled Something's Wrong with Rose, before being renamed to Smile, which would have signified that this is the point where something became wrong with her. The title change actually makes a little more sense now, because something has always been wrong with Rose, but the 13-minute mark is where she is now afflicted with the Smile entity. Coming back from the title screen, we are reintroduced to our protagonist, viewing her through the murky reflection of the table, indicative of her present mental state after witnessing Laura's horrific death. She has just experienced a trauma that no average person would be forced to face head-on, beginning the reemergence of a theme that will carry us throughout the remainder of the narrative. This film implements so many brilliant moments, where the cinematography chosen builds the scares so much more effectively. It builds its dread efficiently, making each scare earned, never forced. Early on, the camera work throughout the film showcases beautiful and unique movement, elevating otherwise simple moments to a more grand design. These choices add to the bizarre nature of the film, accentuating how the balance of normality is being thrown out of whack for our protagonist. Static shots are placed in Dutch angles at times, making them feel off-kilter. In a scene where her boss asked her if she had been there all night, and the immediate next shot showcases her packing up to leave, filmed at a Dutch angle. This makes her world feel skewed, perhaps due to her being overtired or spiraling out of control. Parker Finn seems to choose his angles carefully, framing in wide lenses, leaving bare, vacant space in the backgrounds, causing your eyes to scour the frame and your mind to expect something to show up in the negative space. I started to fall in love with the way the filmmaker chose to rely on slow pans towards something that we are meant to see, rather than just hard cutting to it like most others would. For me, this elevated the scares so much further, allowing them to come into view and linger rather than suddenly startle. It takes its time to build that trauma, to build the stain on those relationships, and increase Rose's desperation to prove her sanity, and to rid herself of this waking nightmare. Surprisingly, this film does not shy away from the gore in the way that I would have expected. Instead, it remains subdued for the majority, but blasts us in the fucking face with horrific and unimaginable grotesqueries. The film goes to some incredible lengths to do everything it can in the practical sense. Very little CGI enhancement seems to have been used throughout the horrors of this film. The smiles in the film are all natural and not enhanced with visual effects. The studio even asked if they could be tweaked, but Finn stuck to his guns, as he wanted them to feel grounded in the creepiness. This helps the film stand apart from that trashy schlock that Blumhouse put out a few years ago that made me fucking cringe harder than that time your sister tried to slip me the tongue after graduation. And I didn't even see that pile of shit. At least, not yet. Parker Finn told the actors who would be smiling in the film that he wanted dead eyes that do not match an incredibly uncomfortable, wide tooth-bearing smile, that it was meant to feel predatory in nature. I think one of the things that I loved most was that all the depth put into this film allowed me to glaze over the inclusion of actors that I have known for years. People like Kyle Gallner, Jesse Usher, and Cal Penn. Finn implements a cool dynamic of the cop that is assigned to the case of her patient's death being her ex, which adds a nice extra element of a love triangle relationship discomfort. The depth of this film's dedication even stemmed into the marketing surrounding the piece. A couple of days before the September 30th, 2022 release, actors from the film showed up at various baseball games, sitting behind home plate, dead still and smiling while staring into the cameras, unmoving despite fans in the audience being understandably concerned. I can't state enough that this film is incredibly meticulous with each and every element it presents, in both a visual and auditory sense. The score is a slow and rhythmic blend of ambience and dread-inducing tones. However, the real horror of certain moments lingers in uncomfortable and overwhelming silence. The entity in the film is something that is never fully explored on screen. We learn about it as Rose does, and since she was unable to overcome it in her condition, much of it still remains a mystery to us. Parker Finn has offered up a few additional details on how the smile curse works beyond what we see in the movie. He says, "The smile definitely hooked me from the very beginning. I love that inherent contradiction that exists within it. Smiles are obviously designed to be a friendly gesture, something warm. It's what we associate with them. But in reality, I think we also use smiles every day to mask what we're really feeling." And that was definitely something that was a motif that was running through the film. And I wanted to see if I could take that and turn it on its head, and let the evil of the film wear a smile as a mask to create the promise of a threat, of something dangerous, something menacing, and see if audiences might get freaked out by it at first. Unlike typical demons, which possess a vessel and attempt to stay with it indefinitely, this demon acts as a type of living virus, transferring from one host to the next. It can be assumed that it does this to sustain itself, consuming the soul of its victims for strength and power before moving on to the next target. The entity's true form resembles a rotting corpse with layers of malformed jaws within its mouth. In other words, it looks like a dead person with multiple others within, not unlike a Russian nesting doll. Considering that it claws its way inside Rose's mouth to possess her, this is directly tied to how it controls its victims. Trauma is also generational and clinical, which is why the entity looks like many people stacked over each other. Throughout the film, the entity can conjure up hallucinations to warp its victim's perception of reality. It's inferred through its actions that the entity can actually read its cursed victims' minds. This would explain how it warps their perception, and how it can influence their actions to do exactly what it wants in order to keep on living and passing the curse. Even if you find ways to get rid of the curse without having a witness, or doing so ethically, the entity would not allow it. It would misguide you with that hallucination, and when you feel comfortable, it would pull you out in an instant. When the phone disappears when her alarm is tripped, it serves as a pretty brutal foreshadowing that the entity has the power to conjure up entire events that never happened, and by extension, the false ending where Rose seemingly kills the entity. The curse is essentially a death sentence. It isn't explicitly stated in the movie, but the curse may select susceptible victims through the fact that they have witnessed the death of a loved one. Laura mentions seeing her grandfather die when she was a child. The widow of Gabriel says that he still struggled with the death of his brother, and Rose is revealed to have seen her mother dying from overdosing. When asked if the smile curse is beatable, or is the fight just hopeless, Parker Finn revealed it's a good question. He said, "I like to think that this thing is sort of enjoying toying with its victims, and being as elusive and slippery as possible. I like to think that there is probably a way to beat it, but I don't know. I mean, it's also quite inescapable." There is also some evidence to support the theory that the smile entity is a collector of souls, consuming its victims by adding their souls to its own. In the drawing made by Dr. Munoz, faces are shown embedded all over the creature's body, heavily implying that it brings its victims' souls into itself after killing them, perhaps as a form of sustenance, similar to Freddy Krueger. Another clue is when the smile entity tells Rose that it will stay with her forever, implying that not only did it kill her, but also consumed her. However, we have no real evidence to support this. Nothing has been confirmed, which I actually kind of like. The affliction of this entity, or demon if you will, places Rose in essentially her own personal hell. She's being forced into the same horrifying spiral as her mother suffered, dealing with something that no one else will ever understand, causing them to treat her as if she is something less than the person that they know her to be. She is mentally beaten, tormented, and dragged through the emotional ringer by its presence, even doomed to repeat the same horrific traumas again and again. Every time that Rose appears on a phone throughout the film, something terrible happens. And it's of course no accident that the first time the entity approaches Rose directly, it takes on the form of her therapist, wearing the mask of someone she is meant to trust. That one person who is supposed to strengthen her mental faculties, but instead is being used as a facade in order to tear them down. In a way, twisting everything she stands for. The same way it twists a symbol of joy and comfort, like a smile, into an image that we should fear. I personally loved that this film takes its time to build, never jumping too quickly toward the explanation of the supernatural. It wasn't hard to notice that this film was aiming to explore the very idea that all horror films utilize as a crutch, the notion that when something unexplainable begins to happen, no one else will believe you. It even accentuates this idea by having each of the characters that become afflicted by this entity psychologically damaged in some capacity. Throughout the film, there is a growing and overbearing threat of mental illness. The way the entity torments Rose, and presumably all of its other victims, heavily reflects how mental illness affects those in real life, driving home the themes of instability. Rose unknowingly packages her cat, Mustache, and gave it to her nephew. Harm or neglect to animals previously cared for is often a strong sign of severe psychological issues. When Rose has a vivid hallucination about killing a patient in front of her boss, it heavily resembles an intrusive thought. Rose's problems often fall on deaf ears, and she ends up severely isolating herself, much like those with mental illnesses crying for help and being spurned by family and friends. They're ignored at best, or judged at worst. The illness runs deep in Rose's family line. Her mother suffered from it, which led her to taking her own life. This threat makes what Rose is facing now all the more horrifying. The fact that no one believes her leads them to assume that she is suffering from the same fate, doomed to repeat history in her own way. By the end of the film, we realize that in some way, it's somehow appropriate that Rose has become afflicted with this entity. In an attempt to isolate herself from anyone else and keep the entity from passing on to another host, she is forced to return to her childhood home and face the trauma of her past head-on. This reveals to us the truth of what happened, that she could have done something to save her mother from her untimely death, but instead chose to leave her to her fate, in an effort to rid herself and her younger sister of the further pain that her mother continued to inflict upon both of them. The mother's growing size during the climax is meant to drive home Rose's feelings that she's back to being a child again in the presence of her mother. The roots of the film run deep into the concepts of trauma. The entity feeds off of it. It is attracted to it and grows from it. It is allowed to perpetuate its endless cycle of death through infecting others with traumatic experiences. As we touched on at the beginning of this video, Rose's entire life is built off of the trauma that her mother inflicted on her and her sister. Her mental disorder bled across the family line, and pushed Rose into making a choice at such a young age that she could not come back from. She later became a therapist, and dedicated her entire life to helping others through the most traumatic moments of theirs, all while carrying the trauma and the guilt of her actions along with her. In a way, this makes her the perfect host for this entity. Rose facing the monster in the past where her trauma was born is incredibly symbolic of the hurdle that she must overcome with her own mental illness. The entity takes the shape of her mother, the demon that stained her with this trauma so many years ago, in a way making itself a reflection of Rose. While she is not fighting the same generational demons as her mother did, at least as far as we know, she is fighting a similar battle. Her illness was born of the trauma that her mother created, And by being plagued with the presence of this entity, she is now able to give the internal monster that she is facing a physical form and fight back against it. In burning down her childhood home, she is, in a sense, letting go of the past and destroying the memories that have haunted her all these years, even if only in her own mind. However, the unfortunate side of all this is that she may have been able to conquer her own demons, but it was not enough to stop this one in particular, proving that it can only be perpetually passed along to the next unwilling victim of trauma. Hey everyone, thank you so much for lasting until the end of this video. I've been wanting to start making longer form content here on the channel, and since my Halloween Ends discussion was pretty well received a couple years ago, I figured maybe I should start exploring these films even further, and talking about them more in depth. This one had a ton that I was able to talk about. I just hope you all found it enjoyable. I placed a link down in the description on where you can get a copy of this film for your collection. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more content. Until next time, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.